In Counter-Strike, one of the most important things is fast communication, as just a few milliseconds of hesitation can be the difference between winning the round and disaster. So that's why for the vast majority of Counter-Strike history, teams have always been national, or at least of countries that speak something similar. Because no matter how proficient you are in English or whatever, there's always going to be some level of a communication barrier. While today, international teams are simply the norm, 10 years ago, they were just a crazy idea until one team came along and changed everything. In May 2015, Kinguin signed the roster of Scream, Rain, Fox, Skitten, and Michaelele. The team had some early struggles and they quickly replaced Skitten with Dennis, but from there, it was just an uphill climb. Less than 3 months after their inception, Kinguin qualified for the Cologne Major, where they would reach playoffs, and in September, they would win Gaming Paradise over Navi. And so Kinguin was quickly showing that it was possible for international teams to achieve success. Right after Gaming Paradise, the team would be bought out by G2 Esports, and they would again make playoffs at the Cluj-Napoca Major, and given the team's record against Navi, it's very likely that this G2 would have won the Major if they hadn't choked 3 match points versus EnVyUs. And this G2 team would then go on and be bought out by FaZe Clan. But while Kinguin made international rosters look easy, many others have tried to replicate their success but only found failure. And so today, we're going to be looking at the biggest casualties. Splyce had always been a North American team. They were never a particularly good team, but they were a staple team. In February of 2016, Splyce miracle ran their way to the Columbus Major, and when I say miracle ran, I mean they were never even supposed to be at the qualifier. They were a replacement for a replacement for a replacement, but that's a story for another video. They got absolutely bodied at the Major, but this whole experience and the cash flow it brought probably got them feeling a bit too big for their boots. Splyce wanted to be more than the mediocre NA team that they were. So in July 2016, after missing out on the Cologne Major, they announced their new crackhead roster. Splyce would keep Davey and Arya, but they would sign Asilian, Crucial, and Machine Gun. At this point in time, it wasn't common yet for NA teams to be importing EU players, and with Machine Gun coming from Mongolia, this was definitely the first time we ever saw a team being made up of 3 continents, so it was definitely the most insane roster ever assembled. Crucial and Asilian were both pretty alright young up-and-comers, but the most interesting part of this roster was absolutely Machine Gun. He was an absolute beast in Mongolia, but it was immediately questioned how well he could communicate in English and if he'd be able to adapt to an international team. Once the team landed in America and started playing, it became pretty obvious pretty quick how much of a dud this team was. Within this team's lifespan, Splyce would place last at almost every single event they played in, which I guess it's pretty hard not to when you have a map win rate of 34%. They didn't qualify for a single event, were on a 12-game losing streak at one point, and they even got relegated out of ESL Pro League. Splyce management had achieved the impossible by somehow creating a roster that was worse than their previous one. The only silver lining about this team was when they got invited to this weird small event in Hong Kong, which they ended up winning. So I guess this disastrous team won a trophy, but they would fully collapse after that. In November, Splyce would kick Davey and Machine Gun, citing specifically the communication barrier in regards to him, which was super disappointing because again, he was a very promising player in Mongolia, but on Splyce, he became the worst player in the history of the team. Asilian would leave in January 2017, and Crucial, who was probably the one part of the team that was actually working, would leave in March. Splyce would build an American team back up, but it was never as noteworthy as this failed global roster. But what is noteworthy is this video's sponsor, PirateSwap. PirateSwap is a website where you can easily and instantly trade, buy, and sell CS2 skins. It's a great way to mix up your inventory from time to time, and PirateSwap is running a lot of specials right now, like the first trade bonus, which helps you get a few extra dollars out of your first few trades. Or if you want to buy skins with cash, using my promo code NOSLEEP gives you an extra 5% on your deposit. There's also an achievement and giveaways tab where you can earn by simply trading on the site. So thank you to PirateSwap for sponsoring this video, and get yourself some fresh new skins at the link down below. If I told you to think about OpTic CSGO, you'd probably think about that one NA roster, that one E-League, or that Danish roster that made it to the London Major, or maybe even OpTic India and that idiot Forsaken. But in the line of OpTic CSGO teams, they have a forgotten middle child. In 2017, OpTic's American team was starting to crumble. It started with Stanislaw moving to Team Liquid, and then Rush and Tarek were bought out by Cloud9. With just 2 players left on their roster, OpTic had to rebuild, and instead of keeping their North American identity, OpTic tried to hit a home run with a whack job European roster. OpTic would keep Mixwell, but they would also bring in the experienced players of Alu and Freiburg, as well as the young players of HS, who was one of the stars of Penta at the time, and Magisk, who had been an absolute beast on North and Dignitas. Combining these experienced players with some young guns, it looked like this could be a pretty scary team, and this lineup got off to a hot start by winning 8 of their first 10 EPL games. They did stumble in some other online events, but they did manage to qualify for IEM Oakland. And you're probably figuring out right now that OpTic was only playing North American teams. That's because despite the team being entirely European, the organization held spots in the American divisions of EPL and ECS, so the team was tied to the region. But when it came to the majors, the team was still European. So in November, they flew off to Romania in hopes of qualifying for the Boston 2018 major. They easily passed through the minor group stage, and after winning their first playoff game, OpTic was in the best possible spot they could be in. Just 1 win in their next 2 games and they'd qualify for the upcoming major. In their first match versus Space Soldiers, they would win map 1, but then lose map 2 and choke map 3. But that's okay, because they could still beat EnVyUs and qualify for the major. They didn't win a single map. So no major for this OpTic team, and after that failure, they'd fly off to California for a North American LAN, where they got stomped by Renegades, and then they hopped over to Oakland, where they would finish middle of the pack. But luckily for OpTic, their dominance in EPL and ECS earned them a spot at each of the finals. At the EPL finals in Denmark, OpTic would escape the group stage by beating up the North American teams, but then lose to Fnatic. And at the ECS finals, OpTic was a group stage exit. At this point, it was the end of 2017, and OpTic management was probably sitting in their office and thinking, what the fuck is the point of this roster anymore? This lineup could beat up North American teams online, but when it came to any LANs or international competition, OpTic couldn't get anything done. They had big stars on a team, and with their brand reputation on the line, this underperforming team was a joke. And with how they choked qualifying for the major, it'd be another 7 months before the next major cycle starts. So is it even worth it trying to fix this team or just start over? Well, OpTic decided that, yeah, this team had ran its course. So in February 2018, OpTic started selling off these players, and they announced their new team, which was that super weird Danish-American roster and was also its own disaster, but I think I'll save that story for another video. Tempo Storm is a North American organization. They've had a lot of different teams and a lot of different esports, and their founder is this guy, which I don't know who he is, but I know he's famous. In 2016, Tempo Storm had a pretty noteworthy CSGO team. The Brazilian roster nearly qualified for the Columbus Major, regularly beat NA teams. This roster was a very hot prospect, and after they qualified for the Cologne Major qualifier, Tempo Storm would sell the team to Immortals, and that team would go off to place second at the Krakow Major a year later. Tempo Storm wanted to try their luck again with Brazil by signing a young up-and-coming team, but that roster was ultimately a flop. Jump forward to 2018, and Tempo Storm is looking to go big or go home with the new CSGO roster. They caught wind of a new team that was forming, and seeing how orgs like MOUZ and Hellraisers were building successful international lineups, they felt inspired and decided to take a chance. So on May 5th, Tempo Storm unveiled their masterpiece. We again had HS, but now with Innocent, Lowell, Soker, and Fox, that Portuguese guy who was part of that initial Kinguin roster. Not the most exciting roster, and having HS in-game lead over Fox certainly was a choice, but we would need to see them play before we can actually say anything about this team. And they didn't even last a month. Soker, who was signed to a 3-month trial, would be out of the team in just 31 days.
Like, we struggled a bit with English, with soccer, and it was like...
And after that, the team just became a revolving door of players. Over the next 5 months, in addition to the 4 initially signed players, Tempo Storm would have an extra 15 players play for them. I gotta breathe in for this bit because they had Shadow, Cheaty, Aiken, Morals, Fates, Tensky, Meadow, Rubino, Spelland, Kriaz, Croman, Horvey, Happy, RPK, and ZywOo. Fucking ZywOo. This team was so chaotic that they somehow got the 3-time #1 player to play for a game for them, which they didn't even win. They lost to Nexa. This team was just a runaway train on fire. It was a disaster on wheels, but somehow they still kept moving forward. In the 6 months this team existed, they won a whopping total of $1,500. And $1,000 of that came from placing last at an event they were invited to. They didn't win a single qualifier in half a year. This team didn't achieve jack shit. which makes me sad to say because I was actually a fan of some of these players, but they were just straight ass. And this team only died when players started stepping down and asking Tempo Storm to terminate their contracts. The team would finally be dead in December 2018, and the experience was so traumatic for Tempo Storm that they would never sign a CSGO team ever again. Yeah, this may be a controversial addition. Today, yes, GamerLegion is one of the most successful international teams, but they went through a lot of trial and error to get there. In March 2019, GamerLegion signed their first CSGO team consisting of Scream, Existence, Knock, Hampus, and again, HS. Existence was a veteran IGL for teams like Titan, G2, and LDLC, while Hampus and Knock were young up-and-comers and would both later go on to play for NIP. Looking at their first few results, they looked pretty decent. They won a few $1,000s, qualified for a LAN, but outside of that loot bet win, most of their money comes from winning just one games at events with bloated prize pools. In July, they would replace Existence with Dennis, giving them a Swedish majority, and then for the next 6 months, outside of the one event they qualified for, they would not qualify for any further events or win any money at all. In October, GamerLegion would dump HS and Scream and sign 2 Swedes, making them now a full Swedish roster, but this roster was just as painfully bad as before. So a reason I call this GamerLegion a failure is because of how quickly they gave up on being international, converting to full Swedish after just 6 months. But the big reason this was a failure was because for Scream and Existence, this would be the last Counter-Strike they play, as just a few months later, both players would transition to and find careers in Valorant. Both Scream and Existence were big names in Counter-Strike and still had plenty more to give the game. But this GamerLegion experience quite literally drove 2 iconic players out of the game. And finally, we arrive at the most decorated team in this video. EnVyUs was quite a powerful team back in the day that reached the top of Counter-Strike when they won the Cluj-Napoca Major. But ever since that win, their team was dying a slow death. In 2018, EnVy decided to finally dump that French roster and pick up a super mediocre American roster. And in 2020, they decided to revamp that roster by bringing in some Europeans. So joining Nifty and Ryan would be Calix, Mihu, Moose, and Legia would be their coach. And in their first few months, EnVy did not achieve anything to be proud of. They did qualify for the minor for the Rio Major, which would have been a big deal, but sadly that major was cancelled, so it amounted to nothing. They finished dead last at CS Summit and basically dead last at Flashpoint. Results were very much not what EnVy was hoping for, and they needed to fix it fast, so they doubled down on being European. In August 2020, they would kick Ryan and Moose, bring in Thomas, and what was definitely their most questionable decision was that Legia would transition from coach back into a player. Coach is going back to playing is something that we see so rarely, and like this guy hasn't played a game in over 2.5 years, and you want him to play again. You think he's going to be able to lead you to victory. So how did these changes turn out? Well, over the next 6 months, EnVy would play in just one event. I don't know what was going on internally, but from the outside, it looked like EnVy was quite literally not even trying to play. And it's not like there was no events for them to play in. There was plenty. There was Cash Cups going on like every other week. They didn't play in those. Qualifiers for DreamHack Open Summer. They didn't play in those. Qualifiers for IEM New York. They didn't play in those. Qualifiers for IEM Beijing. They didn't play in those. Qualifiers for DreamHack Masters Winter. They didn't play in those. This team did not play in jack shit for 6 months. And the one event they did play in, they won just one game. This team was by all accounts a failure. A failure of getting results and a failure to even try. It was disgraceful. And I was actually a fan of that North American roster that they destroyed to create this. So seeing that blow up so that they could build this team of all bench warmers, it was beyond disappointing. To no one's surprise, EnVyUs would drop the team in January 2021, and the org would go off to die in 2022. EnVy did recently announce their comeback as an organization and has expressed interest in signing a CS2 team, so let's just hope they've learned their lesson this time around. But only time will tell. It took a lot of failure by a lot of teams to get to where we are in modern day Counter-Strike. There were more teams I could have brought up in this video, but I'm going to save those stories for the future. YouTube thinks you'll like these videos. Thank you for watching, like and subscribe and all that stuff, and I'll see you in the next video.